It is 3:47 in the morning. The city of Kazan is asleep. The Volga River moves in silence below a sky that holds no stars tonight, just a gray, pressing cold that settles on everything it touches. A cold that has been settling on this city, on this land, for centuries. And in a small apartment on the edge of the old town, a man, call him Rustem, rises without waking his wife. He moves to the bathroom, makes wudu in the dark, crosses the living room where his prayer mat is rolled and waiting in the corner, and whispers his Fajr prayer so quietly that even the walls cannot hear him. He is not whispering because he is afraid, not exactly, but there is a caution in his faith that has been there for so long, passed down through his grandfather, through his grandfather's father, that it no longer feels like fear. It simply feels like the correct volume for prayer in this country. Rustem is Muslim. He is also a Russian citizen, and there are 20 million people exactly like him. 20 million. That is more Muslims than in Libya, more than in Jordan, more than in Kazakhstan. And yet, and this is the question that should stop you cold, how many of their stories have you ever heard? Today, we go where the cameras do not follow. Into the mosques that survived Stalin, into the villages where the adhan has echoed for over 1,000 years, into the lives of people who were Muslim on this soil before Russia was Christian, and who are still fighting, quietly, faithfully, to remain themselves. Here is something that will rearrange everything you thought you knew. In the year 922 AD, over 60 years before Prince Vladimir baptized the Kievan Rus into Christianity, the Volga Bulgars officially adopted Islam as their state religion. Their scholars had already been studying Arabic for a generation. Their mosques already stood where later the Orthodox cathedral would be built. That is not a footnote in history. That is a fact the Russian state has spent centuries quietly burying. The Muslim communities of Russia are not immigrants. They are not late arrivals who washed in after the Soviet collapse or with the labor migration of the 2000s. Some of them have been rooted in this land for over 12 centuries. Their mosques, their graveyards, their scholars, they predate the Russian Orthodox Church in this very soil by generations. Think about that. When Ivan the Terrible rode his armies toward Kazan in 1552 to conquer the Tatar Khanate, he was not Christianizing a pagan land. He was conquering a Muslim civilization that had been preying on that ground since before his great-great-grandfather was born. The Tatars of the Volga Basin, the Bashkirs of the southern Ural Mountains, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Avars, the Lezgians of Dagestan, over 40 distinct Muslim ethnic groups, they are not guests in Russia. By every measurement of history, by every stone and prayer and buried ancestor, they are its ancient inhabitants. But somewhere between the fall of Kazan in 1552 and the mass deportations of Stalin in the 1940s and the FSB surveillance operations of today, these 20 million people became in the official imagination of the Russian state a variable, a problem to be managed, a faith to be contained. So how do you contain a faith that has already outlasted every empire that tried? The answer in the Soviet era was simple, brutal, and very nearly total. Call him Musa. He was a Chechen boy of 7 years old when Soviet soldiers knocked on his family's door before dawn in February 1944. What followed was not an arrest, it was a disappearance of an entire people. In a single day, Stalin called it Operation Lentil, nearly 500,000 Chechens and Ingush were loaded onto cattle trains and shipped to the frozen steppes of Kazakhstan and Siberia. The official charge? Collective collaboration with the Nazis. The evidence? None. The sentence? Permanent exile from their ancestral homeland. Musa survived the journey. His father did not make it past the first winter. And the Chechens were not alone. The Crimean Tatars were deported in May of that same year, the Meskhetian Turks expelled from Georgia, the Kabardians, the Karachais, the Balkars, people after people ripped from their soil because their identity made them inconvenient to the Soviet project. Across the Soviet Union, mosques were demolished or converted into warehouses, stables, cinemas, swimming pools. Imams were arrested, exiled, executed. The study of Arabic was criminalized. The Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage that every Muslim who is able is required to make, was forbidden for decades. An entire generation grew up unable to name the 5 pillars of Islam, unable to read their own holy text in its original language, unable even to recognize the sound of the adhan. But something extraordinary happened. The faith did not die. It went underground. It lived in grandmother's whispers, in names of herbs that carried the names of prophets, in funeral rites that the Soviet state could not fully monitor, in prayers that had no mosque, no minaret, no visible form, only the living memory of what had been, passed from hand to hand in the dark of ordinary homes. Scholars call this parallel Islam, a faith that survived not by confrontation, but by concealment, not by protest, but by endurance. Decades of whispered prayers, decades of faith folded into the daily fabric of life so completely that no Soviet inspector could distinguish it from culture, from habit, from simply being human. This is what it means to be a Muslim in Russia. This is the inheritance Rustam carries with him every morning at 3:47. If the weight of what you are hearing is landing on you, if you are asking yourself why no one told you this, then stay with us. We are only halfway through this story. Subscribe to Fact Seeker right now and hit the bell, because the next time we uncover a world this overlooked, we want it to find you before the silence swallows it again. The Soviet Union fell in 1991. The mosques were rebuilt. Islam emerged from underground. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed as though the long silence was finally over. But silence has a way of simply changing its texture. Today, Russia officially recognizes Islam as one of 4 traditional religions of the state. Ramadan is observed openly in many cities. In Chechnya, Kadyrov has constructed the largest mosque in Russia, a showpiece of gilded domes and illuminated minarets that has been called the most beautiful mosque in Europe. And yet, in the Stavropol region, girls are prohibited from wearing the hijab in public schools, a ruling upheld by the Russian Supreme Court. Across the country, practicing Muslims who are found carrying books by the Turkish Islamic scholar Said Nursi face criminal prosecution because the Russian government has designated Nursi's texts as extremist materials. Reading a religious book, a criminal act. The FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service, operates with a category it calls Wahhabism, a term applied so broadly that it catches anyone deemed too observant. Keeping a beard, praying 5 times a day, refusing a drink of vodka at a work social. These behaviors are flagged, documented, recorded. Young Muslim men across the North Caucasus describe being summoned for conversations with security services. Conversations that communicate, without ever saying it directly, that someone is watching. And then came 2022. When Russia mobilized for Ukraine, the burden did not fall equally. Dagestan, the most ethnically diverse republic in Russia and one of the most deeply Muslim, lost a disproportionate number of its young men to the front. Mothers in Makhachkala, women who had never held a political opinion in their lives, who had only ever wanted their sons to pray and work and find good wives, found themselves standing in the streets holding photographs. Not photographs of soldiers, photographs of boys. This is what it looks like when a state considers 20 million people's lives a resource. When Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, it did not simply acquire a territory. It acquired a Muslim people who had already survived 1 deportation and had spent 50 years clawing their way back to the land of their ancestors. The Crimean Tatars returned to Crimea after Soviet collapse, rebuilt their villages, reopened their mosques, re-established their representative body, the Mejlis, and began, with painstaking patience, to reconstruct what Stalin had taken. Within months of Russia's annexation, the Mejlis was declared an extremist organization and banned. Tatar civic leaders were expelled. Mosques were raided in early morning operations that carried an almost deliberate historical echo.
Imams were detained, interrogated, fed into the Russian justice system on charges of terrorism, for leading prayers, for teaching Quran, for being visibly, publicly Muslim. A woman, call her Saliha, whose husband disappeared into the Russian prison system after one of these raids, described it to a journalist as a second deportation. Same land, same people, different century, different vocabulary, same silence. The Russian state did not move them onto cattle trains this time. It did something more sophisticated. It made staying so unbearable that leaving felt like a choice. But here is where this story must be honest about something more complicated. The Muslim experience in Russia is not a single story. It is 20 million different stories, and they do not all point in the same direction. Ramzan Kadyrov, the strongman of Chechnya, presents himself as Islam's champion within the Russian Federation. He builds mosques with one hand and signs mobilization orders with the other. He funds Islamic education while his security services are documented committing systematic violence against Chechen men who are suspected of being gay or insufficiently loyal or simply in the wrong place. He is, by most scholarly accounts, a deeply troubling model of what happens when religious identity is weaponized as political theater. And then there are the Tatars of Kazan, educated, urbanized, integrated, people who have spent generations negotiating between the Russian identity the state requires of them and the Tatar Muslim identity their families carry. Their language, Tatar, a Turkic language with centuries of literary tradition, was once compulsory in Tatarstan schools. In 2017, the Russian Supreme Court ruled that compulsory regional language education was unconstitutional. A language, unconstitutional. In the years that followed, Tatar families launched what you might call a cultural rescue mission. Private classes in community centers, YouTube channels teaching Tatar grammar to children who would never hear it at school. Grandparents sitting with grandchildren at kitchen tables, reciting words that the state had decided were no longer relevant. And in that image, a grandfather and a child at a kitchen table, a language being passed between them like something fragile and irreplaceable, it is the same image as the Soviet years. Different generation, same faithfulness, same refusal to disappear quietly. There is a word in Arabic, sabr. It is usually translated as patience, but that translation is too thin to hold what the word actually means. Sabr is not the patience of waiting, it is the patience of someone who knows with certainty that truth is long, longer than any empire, any ideology, any state, and who is willing to walk all of it. 20 million Muslims in Russia have been practicing that kind of sabr for over 1,000 years. They survived the czars who baptized their land in someone else's faith. They survived Stalin's cattle trains and the frozen steppes of exile. They survived the erasure of their languages, the burning of their texts, the closing of their mosques, the criminalization of their prayers. They survived, and this is the astonishing part, not by becoming less Muslim, but by carrying Islam in the only place no state apparatus has ever successfully reached: the interior, the self, the quietly beating heart. Rustam finishes his Fajr prayer, rolls his mat, and returns to bed before the city wakes. Today, he will go to work in an office where he does not mention his faith. He will eat lunch in a quiet corner, making dua in the silence of his own chest. He will come home and help his son with homework in a language the state has decided is his primary identity. He will cook with his wife. He will watch the news. He will feel, as he always feels, the particular loneliness of being invisible in a country that contains your bones. And then, at night, he will unroll his mat again. Not because the world has given him permission, because he never needed it. That is the story of Russia's 20 million hidden Muslims. A story that has been present for over 1,000 years, on this soil, in this cold, under every flag that has ever flown over it. If it moved something in you, if you found yourself thinking, "Why did no one tell me this before?" then please share this documentary with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe these stories deserve a voice, subscribe to Fact Seeker. Hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep going. We will be back very soon with the next story the world forgot to tell.